So again, just first of all, my congratulations to the two co-directors and everybody who's been a part of launching this center. My name is Michael McFall. I'm the director of the Freeman Spogli Institute and an affiliated faculty member with the center. As Nate and Dan just said, we want to make sure that we are, everybody should find a seat unless you want to stand. Bronte, why are you standing? There's seats. All right, I've done it. You guys are, you're exercising, right? You're okay. All right. Part of, as my colleagues just said, our idea for the center was to bring together people that don't normally interact, not unlike some of the other centers that we have here at FSI, and I think it's a norm and a ethos of Stanford to be interdisciplinary and to break down these barriers, particularly between hard scientists and social scientists. That's what we are aiming to do. We also are aiming to do applied work, right? That's another feature of FSI centers, that we have lots of departments that do original, theoretical, observational, all kinds of research, but we are dedicated to taking that research and applying it. So we thought, to test the proposition, that we should start with a concrete project. And that's what this paper is. I think you all have a copy, right? Let me just say a couple of things about what motivated this idea. The first and most obvious one, well, actually, let's back up. The proposition that we could get scholars, former policymakers, including one former president, by the way, is part of our team, former Obama administration officials, former Trump administration officials. We always got to remember we have those, as well as professors in law, political science, computer science, and those are the folks that are the authors of this paper. Okay, so we pulled it off, at least for the first project, and I'm pretty proud that we were able to do that in such a short amount of time. The reason that, the substantive reason about policy, why we decided to do this, is this fact happened a couple of years ago, but the response to this fact was very different than it was in previous moments when our sovereignty has been violated. Now, when I say that, please believe me when I say I know the difference between what happened at Pearl Harbor, what happened on September 11th, and what happened in 2016. I'm not suggesting they're symmetrical. What I am suggesting is that in those previous cases, we had studies, we had reports that were done to look at all dimensions of what happened, including the American response to what happened, and then to write recommendations for how to prevent those kinds of attacks in the future. Those two are the most famous, the Roberts Commission, obviously, and what happened after 9/11. This time around, that didn't happen. The Mueller report is not like those two previous reports in several respects. Number one, it has no policy prescriptions whatsoever, and we rather audaciously decided with our 108 pages to fill out the Mueller report. So that's partly what we're doing, because they didn't do it, so we decided to do it. But I also want to just underscore, as we go through the talks, to also underscore a couple of other things that are not in the Mueller report. The Mueller report did not take a hard look at what the Obama administration did and did not do. That was not part of his mandate. We try to do that in working towards policy recommendations. There are other aspects of the attack that they didn't mention at all. For instance, conventional media, broadcast media, print media. We have a whole chapter on our report about that. That's not part of the Mueller investigation at all. And even on the business side, I have to say I was personally surprised, given what we saw going, even the people that he hired, that there wasn't more about these financial ties. And we also talk about that in terms of our analysis before we get to our policy prescriptions. And there you have it. And so for the next, before lunch, the constellation of people that were involved are going to present different pieces of it. I, on behalf of my colleague, Bronte Cass, am going to quickly do the what happened piece. I'm assuming in this room most people know this story pretty well, so I'm going to go through this pretty quickly so that we can get to the prescriptions. And I'm going to focus more, I give this talk around the country from time to time. Here I'm going to focus more on the motivations of Putin, because I think that sometimes gets forgotten, and then what he actually did. I'm going to assume most of you know that, and we're going to be talking about that over the course of the next couple of hours. So defining Putin, Putin's preferences in 2016, and then what they did. That's what I just want to talk about. Oh, wow. And my time hasn't even started yet. I was supposed to start at 9:30, so I'm golden. Thank you guys for ceding your time to me, because I got a lot to say. No, I'm just kidding. First, evolution of Putin. Why did he attack us? I think it's important to think of him not as, which is the conventional wisdom, a thug in charge of a weak state that's dying out. That's kind of what most people think. I don't believe that. One, I don't think he's just a thug. I think he's a very successful head of state. Two, I think he has an ideology that I'm going to talk about right now that he's seeking to propagate in the world. It's different from the Cold War, but it's definitely an ideology, and he has a strategy. And three, he has a lot of capability that I think we've been underestimating for a long time. So at least to get that right framework, that then sets up the predicate for what he did in 2016, which, by the way, was his third intervention in a row: 2014 Ukraine, 2015 Syria, 2016 the United States. So first, quickly on the evolution. In fact, I'm going to try to do most of this quickly and then try to take some questions. Always start when people frame their first thoughts about the nature of the international system. We teach students here at Stanford, and we have some notion that we are framing the way they think analytically about the world. Just to remind you, he didn't go to Stanford. He had a different school of training. And I've had the privilege or honor or difficulty of interacting with him from time to time in my previous jobs. I met him first in the spring of 1991. We're not exactly Facebook friends, but I do think I've gotten to listen to him speak and studied him for a long time. And remember, everything starts with this framework, a framework where we were identified as the enemy back in the Soviet days. That is the basis of his thinking about everything else. Now, attitudes about democracy, I think they're pretty clear, and I think right after he became president, we saw what his preferences, his policy preferences were there. But I would remind you that not everybody agrees with that, and that he did work for a reformist mayor. That's when I first met him in the early years in St. Petersburg. And then he worked most of the 90s, the second part of the 90s, for Boris Yeltsin. So I'll just leave that there, but because others disagree with me on that. I think once he came into power, right away he made his preferences pretty well known. These are some of the things he did as president. And then in his later years, I think he just doubled down on that, especially after he ran for his third term, in terms of constraining independent sources of political and economic power within the political system in Russia. His attitudes towards markets, I think, is more complicated. He didn't start where he is today. I think there's been a real evolution. I don't think he had a lot of education about market reforms when he first took over, and leaned heavily on these people in St. Petersburg who had much firmer ideas. And in the early years, we would have coded him as a Hoover Republican. And I say that just analytically. Like the flat tax is from Alvin Rabushka, my colleague over at the Hoover Institution. We're considered a capitalist society, a free society. We don't have a 13% flat tax. Russia does as a result of Putin and a lot of these other things he did in the early years to open up the market. I think today he's moved away from that. He's become afraid of independent economic activity. And as a result, he's moved in a much more closed way, and that's reflected in his foreign policy views as well. Attitudes towards the West, just to remind you, analytic framework was set. There were these two flirtations, I think, with engagement with the West. One was right when he came in, and he even talked about joining NATO back in 2000. And then right after September 11th, I think there was a genuine effort and a genuine idea with the Bush administration, with President Bush himself. President Putin has a very fond place. He thinks very kindly of President Bush. The deep state he can't stand. The Bush deep state. I've heard him go on and on about that. But there were these two moments where we flirted with cooperation. But then in Putin's view, and this is Putin's view, not my view, there were a series of events after that that in his view proved that we were not interested in cooperation, we were interested in hegemony. And this notion of sovereignty, which I'm going to get to in a moment, is a big part of the way that Putin describes the world. There is an elite group of hegemonic players, of which we are central to, and he, on behalf of others that want to liberate other countries from this, need to challenge these elites. So in a way, it's the populist language that you hear within states, but he kind of superimposes it onto the international system as a whole. And in fact, we debated it with him one day for about 3 hours. This is the first time that President Obama traveled to Russia. Putin is now prime minister. And by the way, he went through 58 minutes of commentary on how awful the Bush administration was. I know it was 58 minutes because I was the person that had to read out this meeting to the press afterwards. The meeting was scheduled for an hour, and I was worried that because my guy had not spoken for the first 58 minutes and we only had 2 left, I was not sure what the hell I was going to say to the press. Thankfully, it went on for 3 hours. We had some things to say. But in that meeting, by the way, Putin always comes prepared for these meetings. Just as a sidebar about other summits we've seen recently, he had an agenda that he was running. It was very clear to me. One more sidebar. Notice we have some advisors at that meeting. I think that's a good idea. And we also have a note taker. I don't know if you can see there that I'm the note taker. Those are all really good things to do when you're meeting with Putin. But we walked through a bunch of mistakes that the Bush administration made from Putin's point of view. And then we got to Iraq. And he said, you guys, because of your regime-changing ways, made a horrific mistake. And you screwed up the Middle East. And, he had a long, fairly articulate couple of paragraphs where he spelled out his argument. And at the end of that, President Obama said, you're right. By the way, he was like, hold on, I'm playing the Russians, you're the Americans. Like, you're not supposed to say that. Remember, he'd never heard an American say that before. And he said, well, you probably didn't know, but I was against that war long before it was popular to be against that war, and we're not going to do that. We're not going to be in the business of regime change, of trying to interfere in the domestic politics of other states. And as we walked out to the cars, I could tell Putin was thinking, well, maybe this guy is different. He certainly talks and acts differently. And that was a moment where, this was still in the heyday of what we called the reset. And I could see he was churning as to whether, in his view, American foreign policy was actually going to change in the Obama administration. But then fast forward for, 18 months later, there were a series of popular uprisings of which we reacted to. We did not start. Eventually, we intervened in one. By the way, President Medvedev supported us in this intervention. Putin, the prime minister, did not. Things got very nasty between the United States and Russia in Syria. And then in that same year, massive demonstrations in Russia against Putin and his regime. And so for him, this is confirming evidence, because we, of course, were behind this. We were the ones that are doing it. I'll get to that in a moment with Clinton, that here we are propagating regime change, only this time against him. And remember, the last time you had that many people on the streets of Moscow 20 years earlier, there was regime change. That's the year the Soviet Union collapsed. So in my view, and then the punctuation mark, of course, was 2 years later, another regime change that we reacted to, but Putin described as us fomenting revolution, only this time a country on his border, this time against one of his allies. So for me, I think those events kind of, reified, consolidated that we were the enemy in this world view that he has now developed, and really crystallized his Putinism in the way that he sees the world, and I don't think that's going to change ever, okay? And just to go through a couple of these things again, so you don't think that it's just me saying these things, I just want you to see and read here for a moment how he talks about it. I think this speech in 2007 was a real pivotal one, where he really laid it out, where he no longer saw the possibility for cooperation with us. Later, when those demonstrations happened, he said, even before they happened, by the way, that we were there fostering regime change, giving money to these protesters. Once they started, and now this is the hook to our report, he blamed very directly, as you can see from this quote, that Secretary Clinton herself was involved in signaling to the opposition to protest against his regime, right? In his view, meddling against his elections, because at this time he was running for president, for re-election at the time. And just for fun, I added a few things. I actually played a minor role in all this. I arrived as ambassador to Russia in 2012, right after those demonstrations happened. And because we're going to be talking about disinformation and fake news later, I just want you to know I've been the target of that back in 2012. This is Russia Today, which we're going to be talking about later today, where they said I was the running this thing. And I just kind of became the poster child of this disinformation campaign against the Obama administration. And when I say poster child, I mean literally poster child. That's a calendar they put out with my face on it in Russian and English. All the other opposition leaders are the various different people of the month. Here's some more disinformation, what we call now shallow fakes. Is that right, Alex? That's a phrase you like? Cheap fakes. I'm photoshopped my head onto a person campaigning for Alexei Navalny, who was running for mayor at the time. Obviously, I hope obviously that's not me, but when it came out, just so you know, it was not obvious to people when it came out. The poster here, it's a little more conventional disinformation. It's a poster at a bus stop. And what it says there is the political circus is coming to town May 6, 2012, and I'm listed there as the artistic director. I think I'll skip this one in the interest of time. These are just instances of what we're going to talk about later that happened during our campaign. And this is just me. This is just a video they put out, a television thing, talking about me fomenting revolution and organizing the revolutionaries, right? All of these guys right here. Okay, you get the sense, right? Now, I'm going to shift gears here. I don't want you to laugh at the next one, because this was my first interaction with YouTube and how to deal with disinformation and fake news. This was a video put up on YouTube 3 weeks after I arrived as ambassador to give you an illustration of the multi-layered campaign that they were running against our policy that they later ran in our 2016 election. At least that's my argument. And then sovereignty, I've already said a lot about this. I'll send this around for people who want to look at these, the way they talk, but I do think it's worth listening to Putin from time to time about how he talks about these things and the idea that we are out there violating sovereignty. What he does, of course, is not a violation of sovereignty. He's got an explanation for that, but it runs through the way they talk about the way that we interact in the world. The second piece to it that relates to 2016 is, again, it's been over time, and I'll just go over it quickly now, but over time, he also has developed a piece of Putinism which I would describe as, his definition of conservative values, anti-multilateral values, anti-liberal values. He sees himself as the conservative leader of the West in particular, and more lately of the entire world. And he has decided that not just to play defense, that's what he did in the first decade of his time in office as president, but he has now decided that he's going to try to export these kinds of ideas, when I'll say more about the instruments of that in a minute. He's a little confused on nationalism. I just want to say that. Russia is a multi-ethnic state, so he doesn't speak in the ethnic nationalist ways that other nationalists do. He talks about Russia as a civilization that puts him at odds with some of the more ethnic nationalists inside Russia. But most certainly he sees that this is a set of ideas. It's not just realpolitik. It's about preserving first and then exporting these conservative ideas. Conservatism, I want to keep emphasizing, as defined by him. And here you have his chief ideologue saying, we see a big plan for the future for our ideas. And therefore, they invested in these ideas. And we're going to talk in detail about how this impacted on 2016. I just want to note here that this is a multi-pronged strategy that is not just about elections. That's a big mistake people make. And is not just about the United States. And is not even more, it used to be focused on Europe. It's now, I would say, a global strategy. So just to remind you of the various instruments that they use to propagate their ideas. One is old-fashioned media, along with what they do on social media, and both information and disinformation. I think that's very important to understand. RT has a lot of news on it. It's not just all propaganda. Second, they've learned from us. They've built NGOs. They built people-to-people ties. These are other conservative nationalists that Putin directly has engaged with. But they also have these NGO ties where they reach out and develop, what political scientists would call epistemic communities between like-minded thinkers. Parties are part of that. Religious organizations are a part of that. And, this Alex Jones interview with their leading Alex Jones-like figure, Alexander Dugin, I think is an illustration of how these ties are forming, not just through state channels. And then finally, they have these really blunt instruments that they use from time to time. But it is accompanied by all those other things to try to change the hearts and minds of places that they invade and annex. All right, quickly on these last two pieces, and if we have time, I'll take some questions. So that's Putinism, and that's what he's doing to try to propagate Putinism. How did it impact 2016? I think it's just obvious now. I hope it's obvious, and I assume it's obvious in this class, this room. Sorry. Stamos and I got up at 5 a.m. today to do Morning Joe to talk about our report, so I'm a little tired. I think his preferences were pretty clear. And by the way, if I were Putin, I think it's kind of a no-brainer if you were looking at this campaign who you would support, precisely because of what the candidate said. One candidate said he would look into recognizing Crimea as part of Russia. He would look into lifting sanctions. He beat up on NATO. He didn't say a word about democracy and human rights, and he had many kind things to say about Vladimir Putin. The other candidate, my former boss, said exactly the opposite on all those things, right? So fairly rational that he would have preferences to support one candidate versus the other. Of course, what's different, and then he just said it, by the way, just to be clear, you don't believe me? Those are Putin's words at the Helsinki summit. What's different, of course, it's one thing to have preferences about who you want to win in a country. It's another thing to try to influence that. And as we kind of summarize bits of the Mueller report and then add these other dimensions, but I just want to emphasize it was a multi-pronged strategic campaign to try to influence voter preferences. One, just to add to polarization, we're going to talk a lot about that later, so I'll leave that to my colleagues. But over time, it became much more focused on supporting one candidate over the other, A, because they thought he was a disruptor, and that would be good for disruption generally, and then B, for the foreign policy preferences that I just described. So again, I feel stupid in this room even summarizing this stuff, but just to remind you, this I think was the most important intervention, stealing information from the DNC and Podesta and publishing it. This also, this piece, by the way, is not part of what Mueller talked about, but I think very intriguing and demands way more attention in future studies where they use conventional media and they put it up on YouTube, and RT claims that they're the most watched news program on YouTube. Just to remind you, on their television sites, it was very clear what their preferences were, including support for third-party candidates, by the way. Big activity here. They even hosted a debate. Think about that. The Russian government hosted a presidential debate on their television station because these candidates were not allowed in other places. Sputnik, again, just to remind you, multi-pronged. This is their news agency, putting all kinds of stuff out, very active on all the platform, on all the platforms. And you don't need to have a PhD in Russian studies to know that when they tweet out hashtag crooked Hillary, you know what side of the fence they're on, okay? Fourth, this is part others we're going to speak in detail about how to prevent it, but the IRA did something radical, unconventional, and, you know, quite amazing when you think about it. Posing as Americans, getting Americans to demonstrate because of their operation, I think that is extraordinary. And by the way, when people say, oh, the Russians have done this before, give me a break. They've never done anything as dramatic like this, the Soviets or the Russians, in terms of our elections. As I mentioned before, this is the part that I was disappointed in the Mueller report that we didn't learn more about. I just want to remind you, it's part of what Putin does in other places. I know that well. It's the way he rules Russia in many ways by controlling money and creating leverage for people that he gives money to. It seemed like they were trying to investigate that, and then there just was not much left in the report. One hypothesis is that it's in the classified part, and maybe we'll learn about it later. But I think moving forward, we need to pay attention to this instrument of influence and exporting Putin's ideas in other elections, including our future elections. You know, then just to remind you, this is just wild. Just to remind you, this does not happen. I was the Russia guy for the Obama campaign in 2008. We did not have this level of interaction with the Russians. I think there's a counterintelligence piece to this story, and I'm just going to leave that. We'll come back to it in questions, and to remind yourselves that Russians who work for the government are always seeking to interact with Americans, A, to gather information from you, but B, also to compromise you because of those interactions. And that I don't think has gotten enough attention, and I don't think these people understood that that may have been one of the motivations for what the Russians were doing. That there is an investigation that's going on for 2 years, that's good for the Russians. That we're investigating that is good for the Russians, and maybe all of this activity was a part of that strategy. I don't know that for sure, but it needs to be investigated further. Then finally, Kompromat. Putin uses this all the time, and they tried to do it, with our colleagues in the Trump campaign, including also business opportunities, most famously the Moscow Tower. And then this, which we talk about at length in the report and have some suggestions for, but just to remind you that they were even playing with much more audacious things. Maybe our people that know these issues better will help us understand why they chose not to use them. But I just want to remind you that they had the capacity to use them and then chose not to in the very late stages. Last, and maybe the last thing I'll say before going to questions. This is a very controversial question, right? And in our report, we come down in a pretty conservative place, which is to say, I think as a social scientist, and we've talked about this, Nate and others, for a couple of years around here, it is an impossible social science challenge to isolate the independent causal influence of these Russian interventions, because we weren't looking for them. We weren't gathering data to do an analysis of it, and that's where I come down. And I feel very uncomfortable when people say, Trump is president because of what the Russians did. I can't say that. But I also feel uncomfortable when people say the Russian intervention had no effect. That seems equally absurd to me, given all those things they did, given how much, in particular, that WikiLeaks played in candidate Trump's own reference to it. And you see Secretary Clinton's approval ratings fall in October week by week by week. It's just hard for me to believe that the WikiLeaks part of the story was not part of it. Other people, Professor Jameson at Pennsylvania, has tried to look at that causal link more closely. I'm not prepared to do it. But the only thing I would say in closing, yes, it was very marginal. The effect was very marginal, but this election was won in the margins, 78,000 votes in 3 states. Last thing I want to say before getting to how to prevent this in the future is just to remind people that Putin is not the only foreign actor that we should be afraid of. And President Trump should remember that. We just saw what a takedown of Iranians on the Facebook platform a couple of weeks ago. My conjecture, my hypothesis is that if the Iranians were running the Putin playbook in 2020, they're probably not running it in favor of President Trump, right? So the point of our piece, what we're trying to say here is that this is not a partisan issue. This is a national security issue. We know, we can explain why, because of partisanship, we haven't taken it seriously. But now that the Mueller report is out, I think it's now time that we collectively, Democrats, Republicans, Silicon Valley, and the government and academia, pivot to the very concrete things that we can do that, by the way, we think are actionable before 2020, and that's what motivated us and animated us to write this report. Thanks a lot. I think I have a few time for questions? Okay. So we do, and I don't want to get ahead of my skis because we're going to talk about that, deterrence in particular. But I think you're talking about media stuff. That's my guess. And so when we get to that panel, I'm going to put you on the spot right now, Marcos, and I want you to help us add to that dimension because we did not give it enough attention. You've thought a lot about it, particularly on the conventional media. And I would just note, Marcos has written a whole book about this. Download it from Hoover today, right after you download our report, and circulate our report. Make our report go viral. I think, this is the first in a series of white papers. I think that challenge is one we have to take on for the future. So thanks for flagging it. Other questions or comments? Oh, come on. I spoke for 30 minutes. Yeah, Matt. So big, hard questions. One was how much did they hold back? And that's Matt Spence, former colleague of ours, but always a colleague of ours, Matt. How much did they hold back? And then how many other actors are involved? I want to flag the second question for our experts that are coming that know more about that. I think the answer is many. And I think mimicking, including by domestic actors, is something we're going to see a lot of. Deep fakes, shallow fakes, Pelosi videos, and I think the challenge of protecting truth and data and evidence is going to be orders of magnitude harder this next time around because people have seen how it works. So, but I'll leave that to my colleagues. To your first question, I want to remind people who didn't live through it in real time the way I did. I worked for NBC News and was doing a lot of commentary during the 2016 elections. And I remember the first bit of, information we got on the hack. In fact, I write a column for the Post. I wrote one in August 2016. I remember just being ridiculed, literally ridiculed for, the audacious idea that the Russians were doing this. And people blamed it on some of that stuff I showed you. They said, well, Mike, you've got all these scars from what they did to you in Russia. Of course you're biased. You're looking for Russians under the bed all the time, right? By the way, I have to worry about the Russians following me all over the world. That's another matter that came out of this Helsinki summit. We'll leave that for another day. I just say that because it was not, back to the media piece, we were really underestimating and not doing our job as a community, and I'm part of it, to try to investigate these things. And then we had some fantastic articles later, but after the fact. And I just think as a society, as a media, we have to be doing it in real time. And what the rules are of the game for exposing that, what the FBI said and did not say, those are all really tricky questions. But I think, we were late to this, realizing it. In the final throes of it, maybe, Andy, you'll speak about this because you were in the government at the time. My impression is that the Obama administration, and not my impression, I've talked to them firsthand, and some of them, including Dennis McDonough, has said this on the record now. So their number one concern was what was going to happen on Election Day. With good reason, by the way. They get blamed for not doing what the more they should have done speaking about this, and I'm on that side. I've sat here actually with McDonough on a panel a year ago. It was a little uncomfortable about what they said and did not in the rollout on October 7th. We can debate that. But on Election Day, that was their real focus, and what I don't know, and it's kind of back to the deterrence question, the story I've heard them tell is they were pretty blunt with President Putin, including Obama and Putin, to try to push that back. But that's a story that insiders will have to give us more information about. Yeah, Steve. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, please. Yeah, Tess. Yes, yeah, please. Answer that question for us, please. And thanks for being here today. Oh, you're not going to answer his question?
I'm gonna pivot back over to you.
Okay.
In this friendly debate, I didn't hear you talk about our domestic politics in your presentation.
Yes.
Not sure saving that for the resilience part later today. But just to throw out something controversial, here's a hypothesis that if particularly Republican leadership in Congress and the Republican candidate himself as well, had been willing to condemn these actions, and there had been unity within the United States on condemning it, the rest falls away and becomes almost unimportant and not something that we would be grappling with in this way today. And I actually still think that may be the case.
Yes.
And while all of these interventions, whether they're ensuring up our elections, our infrastructure, et cetera, all of that matters. It matters a lot less than the elephant in the room of a lack of unity in our domestic politics.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I definitely agree with you. Is this on the same thing, Steve, or different? Okay. That is, that's the explanation for why we didn't have those 911-like commissions. It's obvious, that's why. To this day, including at this event, I was in Helsinki. I was going to say with the president. We were in Helsinki at the same time. We weren't together. And he stood right next to Putin, and somebody from the audience said, are you going to denounce what he did? And he wouldn't do it, and it was shocking. And he will not do that. Now, I understand the argument that they give. I disagree with it. I think he's wrong about it. And I think they don't realize, this is my argument to them, that, think of the counterfactual. Think had the Russians done nothing and President Trump won the election, without their interference. Think about how different his presidency would have been. So why are you defending these guys that have ruined, in his view, this has gone on? Why I just don't, I don't get, I understand he thinks once we open that can of worms, it undermines his legitimacy. I think, I use a sports analogy, maybe there was a bad call in the game, right, 30 seconds before the end of I'm watching a lot of basketball these days. So a basketball game, we declare a winner, but nobody was arguing we're going to go back and rerun the game, at least not people that I respect, because there was a foul. So let's just say we got that call wrong, but I didn't, he could say I didn't do it and then had this investigation. That he chose this other way means that we haven't done all the things you described. You're right. And that's why, just so you know, I know it's a long report, 100 pages, that a lot of the things we're recommending are for the Congress and are for the Valley. That can be done, without waiting for the president to act, including, 5 or 6 pieces of legislation that we endorse. But having said all that, if you don't have him in the right place, especially on the deterrent side, it doesn't sound very credible. It's not credible when Secretary of State or the National Security Advisor says it, and then the president won't say it. The Russians, are listening to the president. Steve. Okay. This sounds challenging.
What you made clear, right, rightly or wrongly, is that in Putin's mind, the U.S. was actively fomenting democratic revolutions around the world, and that was incredibly threatening to him. And his feeling is, you guys are so polarized, I now have my own method, and I'm going to screw with you, and you're domestic politics. Right? What if tomorrow, right, or possibly 2020 when there might be a different administration, there's an offer that says what we need is a 21st century Australia. And you, the United States, and you, the democracies, are all going to agree you're not going to do democracy promotion, you're not going to do anything if it's involved in
So you asked what would happen, not whether that's a good idea or not.
I'm not advocating. I want to hear you reason through it and how you would approach that question, that offer.
Well, actually, I'm going to defer to Larry Diamond, who's here. We're passing the buck a lot here. I'm going to give you an answer, but I also want to flag that they wrestle with that. Eileen Donahoe and Larry and their colleagues, and they're going to speak about that chapter because they try, and I think appropriately so, and I think successfully so, to distinguish between doxing and legitimate assistance for democratic norms. But that's not your question. Your question is how Putin would react to that. He would take. I would say, free and fair elections is a universal value. And so support for that is something you signed up for. And that's part of the institutions you signed up for. By the way, not violating, the borders of your neighbors is also something you signed up for. So I would couch it that way. That's the way I would approach the question. But I've sat next to Putin and had this debate. He wouldn't accept that. I just want to I'm glad you raise it because whether it's legitimate or not, I mean, the arguments we had during the Arab Spring in particular, we said to him, we didn't start this. Especially Egypt. Like, I remember, I won't name the person, but somebody who was not enthusiastic about what was happening in Egypt in our administration. And he was saying, look, folks, he's our ally. Why would we want to overthrow our ally in this thing? We're reacting to these events, and we're trying to prevent them from becoming more violent and more revolutionary. And that was the argument we had with them in Syria. That was Putin's pushback is, no, actually, just your existence undermines sovereignty. The way you guys act, the way you talk, that quote that Clinton said, right? You're actually involved whether you think you are or not, and you need to stop that. That was his answer back then. Because we're talking about IR theory, I also just want to note that not everybody in his government, even back then, agreed with him. Remember, Medvedev signed up for UN Security Council Resolution 1970 and 73 that he knew was going to lead to the use of force in Libya. And just to underscore that he had a very different worldview, but Putin is this way. And, we used to spend a lot of time in the government. There are three things that really, when we were talking to Obama, things he really wanted to know about Putin. One, how rich is he really? That number is always bigger than Obama's number. Two, how popular he is. And that number is always bigger than Obama's. But Obama had an answer for that. Like, if I controlled all the TV in Congress, I'd be at 85% easily. 65, well, that's no big deal. But the third one is this. Was he using these arguments just instrumentally to mobilize his electorate? Or did he really believe this paranoid world that he had? And I got to tell you honestly, I was in the first category, working at the White House. And that's partly probably because of my interlocutors around him. These are cynical campaign people just trying to win elections. That pedophile video, right? I went to see one of my colleagues after that and said, Mike, don't take these things personally. You know how it is in elections. People say things they don't mean. And of course, we had nothing to do with that, right? But it's like, don't take this personally. We'll get back. We're just trying to win an election. What's the big deal, man? You guys do the same thing. By the end of my time in Moscow, and this is a good place for me to end, I left thinking, no, actually, he's a quite paranoid guy. He grossly overestimates our capabilities to do things internally in all those countries in the Middle East, but also his country. He thinks the CIA, I know the capabilities of the CIA pretty well. They have a lot of capabilities. They do not have the capabilities that Putin assigns to them. And even people like me, the powers that he assigned to me is no disrespect to the ambassadors. I see a few in the audience, but the idea that we would be able to orchestrate the opposition in any country, let alone Russia, and that I could hand out money in a way that they couldn't track. I mean, there's 6,000 counterintelligence officers running against our embassy, and yet I would hear him say this in ways, and I would see him say it in ways that were not just for my consumption, I'll just leave it at that, that led me to believe that no, he's actually quite paranoid about what our intentions are, and was hopeful that President Trump would change that, right? Because President Trump didn't talk about that. But their current theory today is, Trump, Bush was a great guy. It was the deep state that was evil. Trump's a great guy. It's the American deep state, of which I am associated with, that is part of the trouble. And here's a good segue to the next panel. That language, that way of describing this world, you now see echoed on alt-right publications and people that work in that world. And that is really interesting and a little bit scary for me personally, because just this morning somebody said, we're coming after you. I think the phrase for me was dumbass deep state. That was what he assigned to me. And they're coming after me because I was part of the cabal that started this investigation in the first place, and we will see you in jail, McFaul. And yeah, some of you laughed, and I kind of laughed, but it's when I testified the last time before the Intelligence Committee, that was what Devin Nunes was implying too, when he interrogated me, asking me, do you know Glenn Simpson? Do you know Ambassador Kislyak? I was like, yeah, I know Ambassador Kislyak, but that's where it's going, and I see this, this ideological affiliation there. I don't want to assign it to President Trump. I don't know what he thinks personally, but in our society, I see that lining up. And with that, we need to stop. Thank you so much.